This episode is all about the art of endings. And I wanted to explore the complicated ways our minds and our bodies respond to loss, change, and grief. But even just the word itself, ending, comes with a whole lot of baggage. When I say it out loud, I can physically feel the word opening up a deep sadness inside of me. If I try to bury all those feelings, they become heavier and pull me down into a cycle of negativity. So, how do we break out of this loop? Should we break that loop? And what would it look like if we embraced the reality of loss in our lives? I'm Valeria, and if you struggle navigating endings, then you are not alone. Today, I'll be talking to trauma psychotherapist Hilary Jacobs Hendel to get insight on how our body responds to grief and how we might help it heal. I'm also speaking with the wonderful Whitney Port, who has been so gracious in sharing her own journey through loss. These days, Whitney is a social media entrepreneur and has her own podcast called With Wit, where she's holding honest and vulnerable conversations about motherhood, the industry, and even grief. Hello, Whitney Port.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I want to dive into our conversation today because when I reached out to you to do this podcast, I had a very specific vision for this episode, and I thought you'd be the perfect person for it. But before we dive in, our listeners will know you from your time of the hills and the city. You were like such an iconic part of those shows. But can you tell us a little bit about the path you've been taking since then?
Yeah. So I was on the show and it opened up this whole world to me. And I really wanted to continue my career in fashion. So I started a clothing line. After I had that clothing line, which I had launched with my father. My father was in the fashion industry. He grew up in licensing and manufacturing. So I grew up working in his offices in the factories, just like really learning the business behind the mass market, like mass fashion industry. So I built my clothing line with him, and then he got sick and passed away and in 2013. And this was like a couple years after the show was ending, when I was really soul searching. Like the show was over, I still had my clothing line, but like there was not really anything getting me out front and center. Social media was just starting to become a thing. And I decided I needed to close down the clothing line at that time, just because it was too hard for me to do, to walk into that office where I was with my dad every day. And that was really hard. That was a really, really hard, like pivotal moment in my life. And I was like, what am I going to do next? So the next couple of years was a lot of soul searching. And I ended up getting pregnant and had a really, I don't want to say like controversial, because now I think it's very normal to have like a really complicated, like just not love your pregnancy essentially and feel okay kind of venting about it. And so I basically then started this career in like building a community around just like being vulnerable while always maintaining my roots in fashion. So now I have my collaboration with Rent the Runway, so I'm still able to design and come up with multiple collections a year and have like that creative outlet. We're doing some really fun renovation products, so like flexing a little bit of that interior design muscle, and then also chronicling that project on my YouTube. We're going back in time and also do reaction videos to the hills in the city on my YouTube, which has been really, really fun. Something that Timmy kind of handles and produces and edits, because he has that producing background, but has been super fun to do and just bring back that community who like felt connected me on those shows, like bring them back in. And I have my podcast with Wit, which is really like the heart of what I do, beyond some of the conversations I have around like motherhood and the complications behind that identity shift. Like really my podcast is where I have my most meaningful conversations with people that I look up to, people that I want to learn from, probably quite like what you're doing. You know, I feel fortunate to have the platform to be able to have conversations with people I might never have the time to have that conversation with. But I'm just like doing so many different things, like throwing things at walls and seeing what sticks, you know?
I love it. And I think that's one of the things I appreciate most about you and just like your presence online, because you're very open and vulnerable about your journey. I find that you created this space of just the unknown and feeling comfortable in there and just learning to navigate it every day rather than trying to find that, okay, this is my definition and this is what I do and this is it. So I kind of want to segue into talking a little bit more about your childhood and specifically talking about emotional education, because something that I've noticed with you and the way you conduct yourself, you're extremely emotionally intelligent. And I just wonder if was it something that was given to you in your childhood?
100%. First of all, thank you. That's like one of the nicest things that anyone has ever said to me. I feel it's so funny. I always feel like I have imposter syndrome because I feel like I am a really smart and emotionally intelligent person. It's like deep down, I know that I am that person, but sometimes the person that I see myself as is like how other people view me, which is like this reality TV personality, which is not really how they feel like I am. So that makes me feel so good just to be like seen by you. So first of all, thank you. But it's 100% my parents. Like while having parents now is, I mean, obviously I lost my dad, so my life has changed so much, but I had a really, really like ideal childhood. Like I had such amazing parents who were, one, so in love. Like I think that how they modeled their behavior and how they spoke to each other was, they were so mindful about it, and it was just like such a partnership. And they had 5 kids. I'm one of 5 kids, so
Wow.
they really had to work together. And also I grew up with my grandparents raising me as well. My grandparents lived with us pretty much up until I was in a teenager. They lived with us. They had like their own little quarters in the house. And I think having them, like having their wisdom and having their demeanor also, like I was having these conversations with, like such mature conversations with them at a young age. And I always sought them out for that. Like I vividly remember I used to go to this lake in Missouri every summer, this like random lake, and visit them. And some of my most meaningful conversations were sitting on this porch with them at night when everyone else had been to sleep and they were sitting outside. And I think I just always loved connecting with them. And my parents were they just knew how to talk to me.
It sounds very foreign to me, but I kind of, yes, but it also made me emotional. Like when you're talking about your grandparents and the kind of relationship, it's so beautiful because especially back in the day, I feel like survival mode was such a, I mean, we're now in our own survival mode in
Yeah.
today's society, but back then I find that it was even more, like on a different scale. So it's just amazing to see that there were those kind of family units.
Yeah. Well, there were different, I mean, my mom had little things, like no childhood is perfect, obviously. And there were things where I would feel like certain senses of of abandonment at times being like one of a lot. And also, I don't know, like a mom that sometimes expected too much and expected you to guess how she was feeling and like would test you. So I have those kind of like feelings of not ever knowing what people want from me, or feeling like people are testing me in a way and like I have to prove something to them. But then they also rescued me a lot in a way because it was so like idyllic, and I think everything was so sunny and 75 degrees. Like once I had to deal with real stuff and like had to deal with real grief, I feel like I didn't really have a lot of those tools to deal with it. And I think that's when I started to hit certain lows because I didn't know how to navigate like real things happening to me.
Do you struggle with your hair care routine? Is hair washing day the bane of your existence? Crown Affairs got you. Crown Affair is a hair care brand dedicated to bringing joy to the process of hair care and to delivering truly healthier hair over time. I'm personally loving their leave-in conditioner, which is a fast-absorbing moisturizing cream for dry, damaged, and fine hair. Right now, Crown Affair is offering our listeners 20% off their order when they enter code Valeria20 at checkout. That's crownaffair.com using the code Valeria20 to get 20% off your entire order. So when I speak about an ending you've experienced, I mean, you were very open about your miscarriage. You mentioned even you losing your father, and
Yes.
I kind of want to take you back to how you dealt with that kind of grief and that ending, especially coming from a household that didn't necessarily give you the tools to handle those.
Yeah.
So how did that feel back then? I'm sure that you are in a different place now,
Of course.
but just taking you back.
Yeah. So it's so crazy because things in those moments feel like, especially with my dad passing, which is a huge grief that I've experienced, and then with the multiple miscarriages, which was like the second phase of grief in my adulthood. I have to learn from them, but it took me so much time to actually get there. Like my grief with my dad, for instance, is never ending. Like, unfortunately, I can't get myself to look at that as like an ending, or kind of even like put an end to that, because to me that feels like I need to keep his spirit alive. So grief in that respect, like when you lose someone, for me, it's more cyclical, and it's more of taking it as it comes and not necessarily like looking at it as an ending, but like figuring it out how it gets breathed into your life now, like when you allow it in and when it's not time to take it out. I had to set those kinds of boundaries, because I think that a lot of people have a tendency to push it down and say like, not now, not now, not now, or don't want to release it, or don't feel like being vulnerable, or feel like they're being a burden. And I think that it's so important that you have those moments to release and not feel shame after them. So I think that grief in terms of losing someone is something that is just, unfortunately, like peaks and valleys of feeling it. But I do think that the thing to learn from it is the perspective that, like, life is long until it's not. And that is something that I read in a book a couple days ago. And I said it to Timmy, and he was like, whoa. And I was like, yeah, it really hit me, because now I want it to feel like life is long, because life really is long for me at this moment. So I'm going to live as if life is not as in like I'm going to take things slowly, but as in like I'm going to have like a big perspective on like everything that I want to do and fill it up. But then I think that it's also about keeping really those things in perspective, because at any moment things can be taken away from you. So that's how I look at that ending.
How do you feel? Because you mentioned with the grief with your father, it's a different kind of grief. It's a different kind of ending. It's not even, I feel like you're right, it has nothing to do with the word ending, but it's a different kind of grief. Is it different from your miscarriages? Was it a different process for you that you had to go through?
The thing that the miscarriage did for me was it brought up my previous grief. Like, it made me just feel this deep sadness for like death almost, like it made me just feel like another loss, another thing that I just like can't control. And so that's what it was for me. It just felt like another real hit. But the the rebound from that, like that I could look at as a real ending because I needed to. I got so low after that. Like it made me so depressed. It made me live in the future so much that I was like, I need to be done with this or else I'm just going to like live in this grief forever. I'm going to live in this like what if phase forever. And I don't want to be like that, you know? And so I had to really face it and I had to put it behind me. And I decided after that, honestly, which is really kind of a hard decision to make, but not really to talk a lot about my feelings about the miscarriages and then what I'm planning to do now, just because I needed I didn't want this like constant conversation in people's heads without me, because I knew it would be happening and I didn't want like this to be a conversation in my life anymore. I needed to take the control back. So now like Timmy and I are dealing with things on our own, and it's a new beginning and a new chapter. And like that other everything that happened in the past is in the past and I'm done with it. And I honestly like I like talking about it in this respect because it's important so that people can realize that you will eventually move off of something and that you will eventually realize that these are things that make us actually appreciate life instead of defeating us. But I don't really like to lament on it myself because there's literally nothing I can do about what happened. Or yeah.
I feel like you've covered and you shared so much about where you at in your journey of healing and dealing with all of that. So I definitely feel like it probably feels so already processed and kind of old news to continue talking about it, which I apologize if we keep like going back to it.
No, not at all. Like I these conversations I hope to have like forever because it's so important for women, especially you want to hear from women who have been through it and you want to hear from women who have been on the other side because I think that's what really gives hope. So I think it's important for me to have these conversations as much as sometimes I'm like, oh, but like that happened. It also I get it makes me happy because I feel like I've really moved on so much. Like I've grown so much, I've learned so much, and it makes me feel like any other hurdle in the future is also just a phase, you know, and that we do have resilience to get through it, and that it does actually make us like more interesting people, I think.
When you felt that grief, was it a physical feeling for you? Was it more like physical or mental?
So for me, it's like I kind of get this pit in my stomach. It feels like a sort of a bad butterflies feeling, if that makes sense. And then I get like this tingling in my hands, which is weird. It's a physical thing. It's kind of like an anxious thing. So I would feel it there, and then I would feel, really just exhausted. Like no energy, lethargic, like my body weighed 1,000,000 pounds. And then for me, I'm like a big crier. And I need that release. And I think that if you can cry, it's like the best thing to do. If you can allow yourself that time to just like really fully let go, and you will feel that moment where you hit that spot where you're like, okay, I'm totally done. Like I'm drained. And then there's like obviously that emotional hangover afterwards. Try to go get outside, like, or break a sweat or something. But it's a physical and it's a mental thing. And I just need to kind of be in my own feelings.
So when I was chatting with Hilary and about her work, one of her big things is this change triangle. And she talks about 3 inhibitory emotions that block us from connecting with our deeper feelings. Have you encountered these? So the 3 of them are guilt, shame, and anxiety as you navigated loss.
For sure. I think that guilt has always been a huge one for me. I think that I've really, really, really worked on setting boundaries with my guilt, but it's been really, really hard. After I lost my dad, there was a lot of guilt about being there for my mom while also needing to take care of myself.
Mm.
And I still have that guilt, which is really hard. Like, I have to set certain boundaries in order to take care of myself. And I have a lot of guilt because I like I wish I could do everything for her and like be there for her as much as I think that she probably needs me, but like I have my family, and there's guilt in that respect of like not being
Mm-hmm.
able to show up for the people that need you after someone has passed. And same goes for the rest of my family. Sometimes I like when something like this happens, I don't know, like I took like a little bit of a step back. And feel a little bit guilty about that. But I also have to remember that I'm working hard, I'm raising a child, I'm growing a family. Like I
Mm-hmm.
need to set certain boundaries, like, and that be okay, and me not be a bad person for that.
How about shame? Because I feel like when I heard shame, I actually was a little surprised. Guilt, I kind of understood where that can come
Mhm.
from.
Mhm. Mhm.
Anxiety, I can understand. But shame was interesting to me. Did you feel like you encountered that?
I felt shame. I felt shame because of naive my my naivety. Like, I felt shame that I didn't really connect to what was happening, like especially in that year. So my dad, he was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and then a year later he passed away. But I like was convinced he was going to be fine. Like, until
Mm.
the last 2 weeks of his life, like there was a mental block for me where I was not even thinking about him dying. And then, which was just totally unrealistic given his diagnosis. And then I went on this work trip. I came home and it was like, this is it. Like, and I have a lot of shame and regret in feeling naive that I didn't like kind of do everything I could in that last year, or like have certain conversations with him. Um, or really understand what was going on. Like, I feel kind of shameful for my like immaturity almost.
Mm.
But I also have to remember that that was probably an emotional wall that I was putting up so that I didn't have to really deal with obviously the scariest thing that could happen.
What was something that people, your friends, your loved ones did that helped you, and some things that didn't help?
Some things that didn't help were certain people in my life saying, "Oh, well, you can just try again," or kind of already telling me what my future should, like suggesting to me what my future should be before I've even gotten there.
Mm.
So don't try to help them plan or think about the next steps for them. That's not what they're
Like
wanting to
solution
hear
mode.
or even thinking about. You don't need to be solution based at that point. You just need to be someone that is either physically there for them if they need that, or lending an ear and just telling them, "Listen, I'm here for you, and if you've been through it, I've been there. If you need to talk, I am here for you." And like literally that's it. But you don't need to do the constant check-ins. You don't need to share all your stories. You really have to wait for the person, I think, to come to you, because we're all so different. It's like a lot of people who feel like that they need to help. It's like in their nature they have like this physical response to like need to be there for you. And I urge you, if you are that person, to just like take a deep breath and think about what that person really what will really serve that person. Yeah.
Self awareness, I tell you, will solve all the world's problems. How do you think we can balance the sadness of an ending and the excitement of a new beginning?
That's a good question. I think like instead of looking at it as balancing them, I think you can look at them as like working side by side and allowing them to both come in when they need to come in. I think that like the sadness, you want to figure out how to like process that and how to get yourself out of that, and that's not like by like toxic positivity or like shaming yourself for having those sad feelings. That's just like feeling those feelings, saying it's okay, I'm feeling this way, it's normal, it's natural, what do I need to do to take care of myself? And then in those happy moments to be really really mindful about why you're happy and how that ending like could have, how making that decision about that ending put you in this position.
I understand. It's hard to articulate it, but I
Yeah,
understand the
the
feeling, that
the feeling of it.
place.
Yes.
Okay, I appreciate you so much. Thank you so
Oh my
much for
God.
joining me
Of
today, Whitney.
course. My pleasure. I'm so happy to do this with you.
And just before we wrap up, where can our listeners find you?
Okay, so I'm Whitney Port on Instagram. I'm just Whitney Port on YouTube. I have With Wit is my podcast, and whitneyport.com is my website. Those are my big things. All
Love it.
right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Reminding all my beautiful listeners that Crown Affair is offering our listeners 20% off their order when they enter code Valeria20 at checkout. That's crownaffair.com using the code Valeria20 at checkout to get 20% off your order. Hello, Hilary.
Hi, Valeria.
I am so happy and honored to have you here with me today.
Oh, likewise. Thank you.
And I would love to start with just hearing a little bit about what you do.
Right now, my main work is that I'm a trauma psychotherapist. And I used to think that was a specialty, but now I think of everybody as having some level of trauma just from surviving childhood. And so I treat everybody in a similar vein according to a method that is called AEDP, which you read a little bit about in the book. It stands for Accelerated Experiential Dynamic Psychotherapy. And when I first learned that almost 20 years ago, I was also going into psychoanalytic training. Psychoanalysis in New York City was sort of the creme de la creme of how to be the most educated as I was starting my business late in my life, because I went back to school at the age of 39 to become a psychotherapist. It's another story, as I was a dentist in my first career.
Wow. I absolutely love your work, and we had an opportunity to chat a couple of days ago, and I mentioned how, for me, something that is always missing in a lot of industries that are out there, in a lot of categories, is that simple actionable advice, something that people can understand and digest and bring into their lives. And I loved reading the book. If I would love to hear a little bit about the book from you. You wrote the book, It's Not Always Depression. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, well, the title is a little funky. Random House chose the title because that's what the article in the New York Times was called. It was called It's Not Always Depression, Sometimes It's Shame. And it's about a patient that I worked with that was neglected as a child. Everything looked fine on the surface. It was emotional neglect. And how that causes us to bury aspects of our true self, our authentic self. We have to bury our core emotions, which tell us about ourselves and what we need and what's important to us. But what the book is about, it's like a basic emotion education in a box. It's a beach read on emotions. And what makes it unique, one is I'm teaching this tool, which it's nice to have a tool. It's the only tool I've ever come across that really, in a nice, simple way, explains in a moment of sort of chaotic distress that we're overcome with, how to kind of understand what's happening to us in a practical way. But the problem is we live in a very emotion-phobic society, and we're taught from the get-go to be ashamed of our emotions with all these myths that emotions are just for weak people and that if you're just strong enough, you can push, not even have emotions or overcome them. And the scientific fact of the matter is that we've evolved to have core emotions because they help us survive, and they happen automatically without conscious control. So you can't think your way through them, and you can't get rid of them. No matter how much you work this change triangle, there's always going to be emotions, and humans will always suffer, all of us, because that's what being human is. So the book takes people through moving down from the triangle, from disconnected and anxious and shamed and guilty states, down to the bottom of the triangle, which you can imagine kind of if you superimpose an upside down triangle on your body. The bottom of the triangle has these core emotions, which are these biological, you can think of them as programs. They provide data about how our environment is affecting us. And it's through those very special emotions that when we learn, and we can all learn with some techniques that we practice for the rest of our lives, how to honor them at the very least and validate them, because those core emotions are the doorway back to our authentic self.
When I read your book, I really wanted to bring you on here to help me unpack a little bit the whole aspect, the emotional aspect of endings, because I have friends that experienced big endings with grief, losing somebody. I myself feel like I experience small endings weekly. If it's just seeing how I'm leaving maybe, an older version of myself behind, or certain friendships, certain relationships. And I just noticed, just by kind of observing, that endings are all around us. And it's not something we observe. It's not something we're aware of, especially when they're smaller. We kind of just let them, get in there, but we are not necessarily processing them. And they leave a little mark in us, in the way we behave, in the way we approach certain future situation even. So I wanted to chat about endings, and hopefully to bring a bit more awareness and emotion and tools to be able to identify and deal with them. So, what are the types of endings that people experience?
Such a wonderful and important topic, and a great question. Let me just speak for myself, some of my endings and how they affected me when I was younger, when I didn't understand emotions, and how they deal with endings now. And I can also share endings from the people that I work with in my practice. But for example, a big ending, maybe my first ending when I was a little girl, was the death of my dog. And at the time, we didn't really do sadness in my family. My mother was endlessly optimistic and would try to help me feel better, but there wasn't really space. She didn't say, "Oh, that's so sad, and it's okay to feel sad when your dog dies." And as a result, I got anxious, and that type of pattern, which these things start in our childhoods because we're wired in our experience, translated to other losses that I've had. My first marriage ended in divorce. That's a huge loss on so many levels. It's not only the ending of a marriage, but it's the ending of a fantasy that I had from a little girl of creating a happy family that would last forever. And my parents were divorced, and so I tried so hard not to repeat that, because it was hard. It was hard on me. The endings, another ending that I'm just so aware of is as, and you can relate to this, as our children get older, they have to separate. It's the job of a child from the moment they're born to become independent, or let's say interdependent with other people, because we're all connected throughout our lives. So each time, when I remember when my oldest daughter went off to kindergarten, and the pull on my heart that I knew something had ended, this sort of sweetness of childhood and being home and all snuggled up together, and various endings as they left home, and as I had an empty nest and my children left home. all created quite a cocktail of emotions that I really can't imagine now. I really can't imagine now not having tools. In my life, many of these losses that I had ultimately led to me developing two major depressive episodes because I was overwhelmed by the emotions, and I really just stuffed them and just kept working. My kids will call me a workaholic. I just keep working, and I thought I could just shove them down and just do. But if we don't stop and acknowledge these losses, that's why it's so wonderful that you're talking about endings today. And then there's various other endings that people bring in, the ending of leaving a homeland, which maybe I don't know enough about your background, but that brings up so many emotions. The death of loved ones, the loss of a home that we grew up in when our parents maybe sell our childhood home, the loss and the ending of a cherished object that we had that we don't have anymore because it goes missing. So endings, like you said, happen all day, every day, if we pay attention to them.
I find that the term ending has this really tragic connotation to it. I think that when I even started saying this phrase and when I was thinking about how to call this episode, and I kept repeating ending, 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 I even felt physically how it was, moving something in me and kind of made me sad. So I think that the reason why I want to expand on that word is to create that space for us to feel all the feels, because they may be a lot of sadness, but to your point, creating that space to accept that emotion is here, is, I think, for me personally, has become a way to not going down with it, I guess. Like if I bury it, it just pulls me down. There's more heaviness to me. I just feel like for me, I've also noticed that the smaller endings were the ones that were more triggering to me, because you can process a little bit, maybe because it's been spoken about a little bit more, the bigger losses and the bigger endings. So you kind of have an understanding of how to approach it. But it's the smaller endings that, when I think about them, make me kind of stop and feel a bit lost. And especially with the kids, I think with the children is where it's a lot of like acceptance and a lot of dropping the resistance of that change, of those endings that are coming my way. And for me personally, I find that, especially now being in my early 30s, I've experienced a lot of endings with myself, and a lot of endings that I had to enforce in a way with myself, because I was holding on to certain habits, certain characteristics in me, and certain ways of doing things. So there were quite a lot of those episodes, and one that especially happened when I had children. And mourning the self was actually a big thing for me. It was probably a year of just being very clueless. I didn't really know how to feel. I felt guilty for feeling sad, and I felt sad for feeling guilty. So it was this constant circle of kind of not accepting what is happening. What does it mean to mourn or grieve a past self?
Well, it's such an important idea because it's really part and parcel for how we heal. If you think in a way of sadness as what's representing our connection to that which we care about, so aspects of ourself, our children, whatever is the object of the loss. And when in the treatment of in psychotherapy, it's all about change, and change then is all about the new and letting go of the old. And in my work, I treat people most of the work involves processing emotions from childhood wounds and teenage and on up. And that when we have suffered, when we've suffered in the way that we were, so for example, let's say that I was put down and criticized repeatedly as a child, and I learned to make myself very small, and I became very shy in this way, right? Shyness is also a disposition. There's nothing wrong with being shy, but let's say this is a response to trauma where I felt I naturally was more gregarious. I naturally could have been much more, but I lived life very self-protectively because I learned that people can be dangerous from my family where they criticized me. And let's say through a process of change and transformation, I now are feeling much more confident, much more solid, and feeling aspects of myself that are generative and new. As people feel that right in the session, as we lean into the new, and a lot of this work is leaning into very quote unquote positive feelings. I think all feelings are positive, but joy, gratitude, pride in the self, right? We actively name those and feel those physically and they're the expansive emotions. And as people do that, naturally, sadness also comes up for what wasn't, what could have been that wasn't, and all the younger versions of ourself that until this moment didn't really exist in the way we wanted them to do. So we have to mourn for what was, what could have been, and what will never be because of how we were treated or how we suffered or by just bad things that happened to us, more catastrophic traumas that there was no control over and that wasn't our fault. And also, when endings happen and we feel sad, we don't have to carry that sadness necessarily in front of us. It doesn't have to be the leader. We can kind of carry it with us like a child, like a sad child that we might have just under our arms, that we're just like, we are with the sadness, but also we're going about what we have to do in the world, raising kids. God knows, when you're raising children, you have all these feelings about it, about life that happens to you, and you go on and you have to try to be the best parent that you can be. So humans are amazing. We can do a lot of things at once.
It's funny because growing up, I always had this thing where whenever I felt sad or I felt stressed or I felt overwhelmed, I start crying. I can't even control it. It's just my body just releases without, like, my mind can't catch up to prevent it before it happens. And as I was growing up, I used to be so ashamed of it and look at it in such a negative way. But today, as an adult, I'm so thankful that it's still this body reaction that I cannot control, that I cannot, put a label on or rationalize or turn on and off. It just happens. And that to me is kind of the signal of like, okay, it's time to stop. It's time to look around what's going on, because my body is pointing out things that my mind doesn't want to necessarily see or deal with.
Yes.
So that's been a wonderful thing. And even for my kids, when my kids see me cry, they already know. They come, they're like, are you sad? What happened today?
Oh my gosh, so cute.
Do we all deal with endings or grief in a similar way or one way?
So assuming that we didn't have messages that blocked us from experiencing our grief, that let's say one has had several years of AEDP therapy, and the goal of which is to be able to experience the 7 core emotions, let's say with minimal amounts of inhibition. That yes, a loss is a loss for everyone, all of humanity, and a loss by definition will, if it's a big enough loss for our particular brain, will trigger sadness. And and all of these core emotions occur on a spectrum. So we might just be a little bit sad because we lost our favorite pair of earrings, or we might be grief-stricken because the love of our life has left us or died. So I'm going to call that sadness. It's all sadness, but it's on a spectrum that we would use different words to describe it, perhaps. So yes, when a loss happens, when an ending happens that's experienced as a loss in our brain and body, we will experience sadness, and that sadness, when we don't get in the way, will move through us in the time that only our body and mind has set out for it. However, what really happens in life is that the feelings of sadness are complicated by the messages that we learned in society and in our family homes, like going back to mine, where sadness, there was no space to feel sad. And therefore, my sadness was mixed with shame. And there are people who lose people in their lives that they had actually difficult relationships with that hurt them. So let's say my father died and my father wasn't a very nice father to me. I would be experiencing the loss of my father, the sadness, and anger at him for all he had done to me, and possibly shame or guilt for my anger and or my sadness. And what ends up happening to individuals in real life when there's a loss, let's go back to the death of a parent, that just feels like a gigantic cocktail of emotions that subjectively feels just like a terrible feeling. It just like lands like a lump because it's all the different feelings, many feelings kind of clumped together. Mm-hmm. And the task at hand to allow grieving and mourning to proceed more smoothly is to be able to untangle all the various emotions. So again, some of us can do this on our own by following the prescription really in my book. I don't know anywhere else where this exists because I took what happens in therapy sessions and I said, this is what happens. Practice this on your own until you get stuck, and then bring this book to a therapist and see if they can help you, or hopefully find a therapist trained in AEDP. So what I would do on my own, just an example of my process in terms of being able to go into a private room and try to parse out the feelings that I was having by going into my body. And I will literally ask myself, by tuning into my body, Hilary, am I sad right now? Check. Am I angry right now? Check. Am I feeling ashamed right now? Check. Am I feeling joy right now? No. Am I feeling excited? I go through all the core emotions, and then the ones that I check, I come back to one at a time. I find the feeling in my body, and I breathe into it, because really emotions know what to do, as I mentioned before, if we get out of their way. And the way we get out of their way is to create sort of a metaphorical space. You can even imagine that there's a lot of space and air in between each emotion. And the way a surgeon uses a scalpel to heal and change people, what we do is we use our focused attention. There's something about focusing our attention, which comes from our cerebral cortex and subcortical areas, on a body sensation that causes everything to start moving. And the emotion, when we get out of the way, comes up and out in its pure form. Now, this may take a long time for someone may be blocked and it doesn't happen that way. But what the book shows is that with the help of a therapist, what that looks like, so that when it happens inside you, we don't have to be frightened. We have this feeling. When I teach about emotions, I kind of use the example, it's like stubbing your toe. So you're like gallivanting, walking around your house, and boom, you stub your toe. And it doesn't hurt right away. It starts, but then you feel it, and it starts to build, and the pain is going up, and you're like wondering, how bad is this going to get? Mm-hmm. And then it crescendos, and then it starts to feel better. And we may even breathe automatically, because breathing helps us regulate pain. That's why they teach breathing for childbirth, right? So we breathe, and then we let it go and the wave comes. And that's exactly how it is with a core emotion, particularly sadness. We focus on the sadness in the body. We take these long, slow, deep belly breaths into our belly and out as we watch and stay with it, and it rises and falls. And then when we ride the entire wave of a core emotion, we drop into that beautiful area that's located at the bottom of the change triangle, which is called the open-hearted state of the authentic self. In nerdy, sciencey, jargony terms, it's the state of our nervous system being regulated and balanced, and we feel in those states calm, and that we can be compassionate to ourselves and to others, and curious and connected to ourselves and others. And that's the state that we want to spend more and more time in.
Because you mentioned, supporting ourselves and seeking professional help from someone that can support us while we go through these kind of emotions. As a friend, how can I support a friend or a loved one when they're going through a period of grief or loss?
So I've written about this quite a lot because for so long I tried to fix people. Anytime someone was sad or experiencing some sort of anything, I would be like, it would make me uncomfortable because I struggled with sadness. And so people try to fix things. It's interesting. If you hear all the complaints with women saying about men, they're always trying to fix, they don't listen because the sadness makes them uncomfortable and they're not aware of that.
It's the hero syndrome, right?
Exactly.
We
And what they don't
come
realize,
to save, right?
Exactly, is that hero syndrome is coming from a place of vulnerability, and that the intolerance of what it means to sit with sadness. Because emotions, one of the qualities of emotions is that they're contagious. You might know if a baby starts crying, then and they're in a room of a lot of babies, or if all the babies start crying, or if someone starts laughing hysterically, other people will start to laugh. So you get a sense of that. So the way to be with sadness with someone else is first and foremost, not try to fix it, but to just be. So if you told me you were sad right now, something bad happened, and I might say, oh, that sounds hard. Do you want to talk about it? I would be happy just to listen, not do anything. I know you're going to be okay. And I want to make space for you just to share. Let me know if you need a hug. Do you want me to just sit with you? It's really about being without shutting down and without being intrusive.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Hilary, where can listeners find you and learn more about your work?
The first and foremost, for people that like to read books, self-help books, or listen to books, is I would highly recommend getting a copy of It's Not Always Depression, Working the Change Triangle. It's the Change Triangle book, and you can get it at your library. If you don't want to buy the book, will probably be helpful. But short of that, on my website, I have tons of free resources. It's really a free resources hub because my passion is educating people about emotions. So there's tons of articles, there's videos that help you get in touch with certain emotions, there's presentations, and so HilaryJacobsHendel.com, and Hilary has one L. Or you can just Google the Change Triangle and just get a picture of it. I'm all over social media, and you can find me there, and I try to just give little tidbits of information, and I hope that people listening would sign up for my email list if they're interested in this type of information, because I send out a new blog once a month.
There's no excuses. The information is out there. You are providing it. I'm eternally grateful for your time and all that you shared with us. I cannot wait to implement the Change Triangle into my life with my emotions. Thank you so much, Hilary. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Valeria. I'm just honored. What a pleasure.
Looking for your new favorite hair care brand? Well, look no further than Crown Affair. They are a hair care brand dedicated to bringing joy to the process of hair care and to delivering healthier hair over time. Their dry shampoo has been my new go-to. It's this nutrient-rich dry shampoo that gives you the feeling of refreshed, fuller, silkier hair without all the work to get it. I love picking it up whenever. I just don't have the time or the energy, but my hair really needs it. Check them out at crownaffair.com, and don't forget they are offering all of you 20% off your order when you enter the code Valeria20 at checkout. That's crownaffair.com with the code Valeria20 to get 20% off your entire order.